Hello, and welcome to Looking Into, the short form true crime show. I'm your host. Chuck Morgan was, for the most part, a devoted family man, an escrow agent. But in 1977, he was found dead in the desert in Arizona, in a case that is about as bizarre as it gets for a supposed for a death. This was a death that was seen by police as a suicide. But the strange part is this: Chuck Morgan was found wearing a bulletproof vest with a with his head shot in the back. His gun, his Magnum, was found not too far from him. As Don Devereaux, a reporter who had looked into this case and other cases, had noted, in his days of being a journalist, he had never seen anyone decide to commit suicide by wearing a bulletproof vest and shooting themselves in the head. And that's just the beginning of this very strange case. I mean, there's more to this tale. Now, as I mentioned, Chuck Morgan was an escrow agent. He was pretty devoted to his family. In fact, he would always drive his daughters to school. And he did this in March of 1977. Actually, March 22nd of 1977. He drove his daughters to school, and then he was gone, disappeared. Chuck didn't wind up coming home, so his family was extremely concerned. On March 25th, Chuck came back, but he was in quite a state. First of all, he was zip tied. His hands were bound together with zip tie. He also was supposedly missing a shoe. Now, he also managed to come into the house. How he managed to muster all that energy, I don't know, but he came into the home. He didn't talk to his wife. Instead, he had to communicate via pad. So wrote in a pad. He wrote in a pad to his wife. And he did this for about a week. His wife took care of him. Now, his wife had to take care of him because he had written that his throat had been, something had been added to his throat, a hallucinogenic substance. And so he couldn't speak. Now, Morgan also said something else, which was rather odd. He said that he had been an undercover, at least at some point during the week before he could speak. He stated that he was an undercover agent for the federal government. Actually, he was more of an agent for the Treasury, and that he was working with the government in regards to organized crime, in dealing with organized crime. Now, Morgan, on the night that he came home, March 25th, stated to his wife not to call the police. He said, "You can't do that." He wrote, I should say, "You can't do that because the result will be death." Essentially, Morgan was trying to communicate that it would mean death not only to him but to the family if she informed the authorities, and even tried to get a doctor involved. So as I mentioned, Morgan's wife took care of him for about a week, and even though he kind of got back on his feet, it was clear that whatever he had gone through and whoever had put him through whatever his ordeal was, had inflicted a good deal of damage. Now, This case, just before I go on, was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. So if you're interested in this case, at the end of this, I would suggest that you take a look at Unsolved Mysteries and that segment. It's very, it's a fairly interesting segment, and that's where I first found out about this case, was through Unsolved Mysteries. Now, as I mentioned, eventually got back on his feet. Now, what Morgan did was he started wearing a bulletproof vest. He also made sure his daughters were not going to be walking to school. He was going to be driving them as he always did, just to make sure that they were safe. Unfortunately, in June of 1977, specifically June 7th, Chuck disappeared again. This time he wouldn't come back. This is when he was found dead. Sorry. So Chuck was later found dead. So a couple days, so about 11 days after he disappeared, Chuck was found dead. He was found dead in the desert, as I mentioned before, wearing a bulletproof vest with a gunshot in the back of the head. His gun near him. Now, before that happened, a couple of days before, his wife, Ruth, known as Ruthie, got a call from a woman she certainly didn't know, and who I believe to this day remains relatively unknown. Now, the woman stated to Ruthie, now this was 9 days after Chuck disappeared. She said to Ruthie, Chuck's all right. Ecclesiastes 12:1-8. Now, I'm not a religious person, but my understanding here is an interesting part of that verse that may have some relevance here. Very mysterious. People can go and look it up. If you're religious, you may want to look it up. This was an interesting part of that, I guess it would be passage. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Believe it. Now, the reason I cite that part of it is the fact that Chuck, now most people are mystified. Again, if you're interested, you can look up the entire verses. If you're religious, you can look it up, I'm sure. I cite that part of it because, again, 2 days after this call, Chuck was found dead in the desert. Now, what does the part of this passage say? Then the dust will return to the earth. Chuck was found dead in the desert. Now, with everything else, it's hard to decipher what the relevance of this is. But I think this part is relevant to what happened to Chuck. Now, as I mentioned before, Chuck was found dead of a gunshot wound to the back of the head while wearing a bulletproof vest. Now, that was an extremely odd occurrence. But things get even odder. He had his car nearby. In the car, there were sunglasses. They didn't belong to Chuck. He had a box of ammo that was in the car. You also had a tooth, I believe it was a tooth of Chuck's, that was wrapped up in a white handkerchief. Again, as I say, it gets odder. Then, as if all that wasn't strange enough, on his body Chuck had a $2 bill that was clipped to his underwear. Let me repeat that. A $2 bill that was clipped to his underwear. On the actual bill itself was written, excuse me, was written 7 names in Spanish. So 7 Spanish names from A to G. So alphabetically. 7 Spanish names, A to G, listed. Also cited, interestingly enough, was Ecclesiastes 12, 1 to 8. And using the serial number of the bill, number 1, and a line across 8. On the back of the bill was a rather primitive map that was drawn. And the map supposedly was of the cities of Robles Junction and Salacity that are in relation to Tucson, Arizona, and Mexico. Now, these were cities where there was a great certain amount of activity, like smuggling. Like I said, it gets very strange and very odd. Is that enough for you? Is that strange enough for you? Then we find out that this unknown woman, we still don't know who she is, but she has a sort of nickname, Green Eyes. Green Eyes contacts law enforcement in Arizona. I think it's the sheriff's department. She says that she had met with Chuck or saw Chuck. And according to her, now Green Eyes was the woman who called Ruthie. You know the passage, Ecclesiastes? That was what this Green Eyes had told her. And also told her Chuck was all right. Well, it ended up he wasn't all right. In any event, this Green Eyes lady, this lady known as Green Eyes, states that she had met with Chuck or saw Chuck at a hotel. He was staying at his hotel for about a week. Hold up there. Now, according to Green Eyes, Chuck had a briefcase full of money, thousands of dollars. Why did he have this briefcase full of money? According to Chuck, there was a hit that was placed on him. And he was, according to Green Eyes, going to even meet with the hitman, I guess, to try to buy him off. Now, remember all the details about the way Chuck's body was found, the crime scene. He's wearing a bulletproof vest, which we know he took up after whatever ordeal he ostensibly went through. We know he was armed because his Magnum was there. Now, nitrate tests indicate that Chuck had fired a weapon. Whether he fired that weapon can't be proven. It also seems unlikely. Now, and here's a last part that I left out about the crime scene. Now, notice I said that the Magnum was found, Chuck's gun. No fingerprints on the gun. Not only no fingerprints on the gun, no fingerprints, I think, on anything else for the most part. So, as if all that isn't odd enough, there's one more thing. One more that I'm going to bring up. One more, I wouldn't say too odd, but odd enough aspect. 2 individuals show up to Chuck's home, really Ruthie's home now. They claim to be FBI agents. They quickly flash an ID. And they demand to come inside and take a look. And they end up basically turning the entire house upside down, looking for something. Now, interestingly enough, Chuck had told his wife that he had a letter that he had written to his dad that would outline everything. Should something happen to him, a letter that we wrote to his dad that would outline everything that he was involved in. I guess all these aspects. Now, it's unsure what the agents were looking for. These agents were looking for. Now, why do I call them agents? Because Don Devereaux, the reporter, had actually called up the FBI and asked about the quote-unquote raid that occurred at Ruthie's house. And they had said that they didn't know anything about a raid. It wasn't anything that was supposedly sanctioned by their agency. So, in this case, we are left with nothing but questions. Why were two quote-unquote agents searching Ruthie and thus Chuck's house? Why was Chuck found in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest? Not much of a mystery, but having a bullet hole in the back of his head while wearing a bulletproof vest and having a $2 bill taped to his underwear. Why are there no fingerprints? Because the law enforcement said this was suicide. If it was, why were there no fingerprints found anywhere? How can somebody off themselves, commit suicide, and then not leave any fingerprints in the middle of the desert? Who is Green Eyes? What was Green Eyes doing with Chuck? How did she know Chuck? What was her involvement with Chuck? Why did she decide to call Ruthie? And why say that Chuck was all right when, in essence, he ended up dead? What's the significance of the biblical passage? Ecclesiastes in Ecclesiastes. Questions that remain unanswered. Even more questions. Was Chuck Morgan really involved with the Treasury Department? Was he really involved with the federal government? What was his involvement? If so, what was his involvement in regards to organized crime? Supposedly, Arizona was a haven for a lot of organized crime types in the 70s. This is the problem with a lot of cases. This is the problem with very strange cases like the death of Chuck Morgan's. Too many questions and not enough answers. Now, what do I think? Well, I think that Chuck was likely involved in some way with the federal government. Was he an agent? I don't think so. Probably being used as a kind of informant type, or close to it. I think that whoever, and I certainly don't believe that Chuck decided to end his own life. Not in that fashion. That doesn't seem likely to me. A man who would want to end his own life doesn't wear a bulletproof vest and then try to shoot himself in the back of the head. Doesn't make sense. I think Chuck was involved with activity. Now, he may have been involved with the government in some capacity. But I think more as a intermediary. And I think that's probably what got him killed. Beyond that, only time will tell. And that's it for looking into. Take it easy, folks.